Good morning and welcome to our program this morning, featuring one of the most prominent public servants in Africa, Ambassador Dr. Monica Juma, who currently serves as the Cabinet Secretary in the Ministry of Energy of the Republic of Kenya. I see many friends out in the audience this morning, but for those of you who don't know me, I'm Raleigh Flynn. I'm the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, which is a nonpartisan think tank based in Philadelphia. We do research on international affairs and national security and do events such as this, as well as many, many virtual events. And I'd also like to welcome our audience, our Zoom audience as well. One note, we're going to be going a little longer this morning than we usually do. We'll be ending around 10:15 this morning. So for the Zoom audience, please take that into account. About halfway through the program or thereabouts, we'll be taking your questions as well. So those who are on the Zoom, please put those down at the bottom of your screen. There's a Q&A. You can put the questions in there. Finally, I would like to thank our members and supporters for their support to FPRI. We could not do this without you. And for those of you who aren't in that category, please consider becoming a member or supporter of this organization. You can find us online, www.fpri.org. Lots of articles and reports to read, and we have very robust coverage, as you might imagine, of Eurasia these days, as well as Africa. So please check us out. Our moderator this morning is going to be Ambassador Charles Ray. And Ambassador Ray is a member of FPRI's Board of Trustees, as well as the chair of our Africa program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. And Africa is our newest program. It's about a year and a half old and has grown by leaps and bounds under Ambassador Ray's leadership. Ambassador Ray served as the U.S. Ambassador to the Kingdom of Cambodia and to the Republic of Zimbabwe. He was the first U.S. Consul General to Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam, opening the Consulate General there in 1998. He was also Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for POW Missing Personnel Affairs and was responsible for DoD efforts to account for those missing in combat from World War II to the then current conflicts, and for policy related to rescue of personnel who become isolated, missing, or taken in service abroad. Prior to joining the Foreign Service in 1982, he had a full career, 20 years in the United States Army with postings in Europe and Asia, including 2 tours in Vietnam during the war. After retiring from the Foreign Service in 2012, he's engaged in consulting, public speaking, and writing. He's the prolific author of more than 30 works of fiction and nonfiction. He's also a member of the board of directors of the American Academy of Diplomacy, communications director for the Association of Black American Ambassadors, a member of the American College of National Security Leaders, a member of the Washington Institute of Foreign Affairs, and a member of the board of directors of the Cold War Museum. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the program over to Ambassador Ray.
Thank you, President Flynn. And it's an honor for me to welcome all of you and to welcome our special guest this morning, Ambassador Dr. Monica K. Juma, or as she just informed me, MK Juma. I'm reluctant to read her bio to you because we're only here for an hour and going over all the impressive things that Ambassador Juma has done would take most of the hour. I will say that in addition to being the Cabinet Secretary for the Kenyan Ministry of Energy, she has also served in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Kenyan Ministry of Defense, and I believe the Ministry of Interior. And if that's not enough, she was also ambassador to Ethiopia and Djibouti. A lot to pack into one life for one so young. We look forward to hearing what she has to say this morning about the energy sector in Kenya. And without boring you with my trying to parse all of her achievements. I will give the floor to her to say a few words.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Ray. Madam President, colleagues from the various establishments here represented, good morning. Good morning. We greet where I come from as a first thing. I am delighted to join this distinguished audience at this magnificent address for an opportunity to reflect on the state of play on the matter of energy, which has assumed a geostrategic place in our world today. But before I delve into this, allow me on the onset to thank my dear friend, Peter Morocco, who made this happen. When I spoke to Peter this morning, he was in the middle of a miracle, just having become a parent. But he had spared time to make this session come true. So I want to express my gratitude to him and to you, Madam President, for making this happen. This opportunity is of a significant value to me because it falls within the framework of the bilateral strategic dialogue between the Republic of Kenya and the United States, which I had the privilege to execute as the Cabinet Secretary responsible for Foreign Affairs in 2018. I have been witness to a relationship that continues to grow in leaps and bounds in terms of its scope and its depth. Across the ministries where I have served, from Interior to Foreign Affairs to Defense, I have seen a relationship that has grown in terms of its scope of area, from trade and investment to internal security, to cooperation in counterterrorism and violent extremism, and we continue to engage on regional and multilateral issues. So I have seen this relationship bring value both ways, to ourselves as a nation, but also to our region and to the world at large. It is therefore my sincerest hope that energy can find a place in this framework to enable us regular review of the state of play. I'm in town to join colleagues from Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as from the United States government, together with the private sector and other interested stakeholders for the 2022 Power Summit that commenced yesterday. I have, on the sidelines of this meeting, had occasion to exchange views with a number of people, including the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary, Julie Siqueira, and the advisor to Senator John Kerry, and a number of other colleagues. And I just want to pick out a number of things that are beginning to emerge. First, the energy transition is country specific. Each situation is different, and therefore there is a need to nuance the definition of what transition means for every country. In some countries, transition from fossil fuel to greener energy is an imperative. In others, we actually might wish to speak about the leapfrogging from no power to a new form of power, perhaps the future of renewables. In others, we probably need to speak about alternatives in that transition. What are the intermediaries in the journey of transition? To my mind, this is a first order issue from a policy framework because we will need it to clarify the challenge at hand, to define the forms of and determine the pathway through which we can target and deploy both programmatic and project options. Secondly, the current trends suggest to me an expanding opportunity to optimize on the area of renewable energy. And I think the more diverse, the better. And more significant of this opportunity is for me, the possibility to leverage energy in order to deal with a world that is increasingly facing risks and threats, some of them in some regions and countries becoming existential threats to their survival, in particular the climate crisis. In other words, how do we use the energy agenda to determine the development trajectory of societies? And I believe seriously that as we have seen various historic epochs being defined by a particular driver, we are at a historical moment where the world will be defined in the manner in which we pursue the energy agenda. So how do we make sure societies thrive and we do not accentuate vulnerabilities? And I think this is a critical question, particularly as we are trying to emerge from the effects of the COVID-19. Fourth, I believe it is an opportunity for moving to green growth and to answering some of the festering challenges that are creating a great measure of unease across the world, particularly in the developing world. How do we spur industry? How do we create dignified jobs? How do we create a force multiplier in order that we can incentivize growth that is just and that brings everybody on board? In other words, how do we contribute to agriculture using our green growth? How do we reduce emissions by green growth and so forth? And lastly, I think all these call for very bold action to reimagine the future of the world from the eyes of a new energy dispensation. The desired and envisaged transition is, to my mind, unprecedented in the shift. It is unprecedented in the types of energies required. It is unprecedented in the scale that we must grow, and it has profound implications in terms of technological and geopolitical trends across the entire world. There is growing discussions and exploration with a variety of renewables, which are forming the edge of this far-reaching global energy shift. This transition will also shift with commensurate political, technical, environmental, and economic disruptions that policymakers must deliberately manage. And I think this is the underlying operative word. A fundamental question that must drive research, that must drive, in my view, policy options and project execution is how to ensure a just transition that guarantees energy security in order to protect the world as we drive development for all. For instance, despite contributing only 4% of global emissions, the African continent is the worst hit by the effects of climate change. We know that. We have seen growing vulnerability. We are witness to livelihoods being destroyed at the individual, at the family, at the society level, whether it's because of disruption in agricultural production. We have seen the effects on health. We've seen the effects on food security. We've seen destruction of homes and infrastructure, and we have seen loss in huge scale across the continent because of these vulnerabilities. And these have had profound impact on the income levels and the dignity and the disparity between those who have and those who do not have, not to mention the adverse effects on diversity. Today, more than a half of Africa's population still lacks electricity, about 800 million of people. Many of them still cook with traditional fuels. And the effect of this from a health perspective is we've seen people not just get sick, but we've seen a large number of people every year actually die. It has a direct impact on productivity, particularly of women and girls who must do the cooking. And so the focus on clean cooking is not just a matter of gender, it's a matter of economic productivity, it's a matter of the state of health of a nation and the people. But perhaps the most significant risk to this challenge today will be resolved is really our ability to define this as a public interest and public good. And this, I think, is the most difficult thing because countries think in terms of national, very limited national interests. But it doesn't matter if one country does very well and it is carbon negative if the others don't do something. And the question is, how do we make this a public good of public interest to all? It requires collective action by all. And this, in my mind, is where international cooperation becomes an essential piece in the global energy transition story. Each country must commit to this transition because if we don't, We will not have strengthened collaborative action. And it means that part of the shifts that are needed, particularly in terms of access to finance, which is very important, will not happen. And we all know the story. We all know the story from the Paris Agreement, 100 billion annually. A lot of the world is still waiting because there is not this political commitment to make sure that these pledges translate to resources and are moved. We must have finance that is affordable to make this shift happen. We must have finance that is accessible. We must have finance that is timely and that is deployed to the right projects that are relevant and that will enable the scaling that we are envisaging. So these pronouncements and commitments needs to be real, need to be translated into reality. We must also evolve a framework that enables capacity building, including extensive reskilling, upskilling, and retooling of workforces. It cannot be envisaged that we will replace workforces and not have an unrested world. So how do we make sure that we provide dignity for people as we do this? And finally, we must have technological innovations and transfer that allow for relevance, that allow for adaptability, that allow for affordable technology at the end of the scale. If we don't do this, then we will not respond to the needs of the user at the lowest level, and we are likely to have challenges. There must also be focus on institutional and operational issues. Across the world, and largely in the developing space, we are witness to poorly performing energy sector utilities. I mean, this is a big area everywhere. Whether you're talking about the east to the west, there is a struggle with the performance of energy sector utilities, in spite their being the centerpiece in the puzzle. So the envisaged shift must also focus on deliberate efforts towards ensuring that our energy utilities perform, improve operational efficiency, re-engineer business processes from the levels of planning, energy planning, to regulation, to the entire value chain, in order that we can have the boldness to frame a new energy future. It is this reality that is underpinning our wide-ranging efforts of reforms in the energy sector in Kenya. I have been tasked by the president to move us towards our constitutional mandate that provides for clean, reliable, sustainable, low-cost energy. Now, we are very lucky. About 20-some years old, our government took a bold decision to go green, Then it was not fancy to be green, but we did. And that decision paid off. It paid off today. We disburse 92% on our grid is renewable. But with that exponential growth, there are also a number of challenges because this is a new frontier in terms of technology, for example, for storage, in terms of dealing with that intermittency, in terms of dealing with the mix of the renewables and so forth. And so we are at a point where we would want to continue being in that vanguard role. But this means there has to be commitment to help us in terms of partnering for innovation, in terms of transfer of technologies, in terms of being bold to do things that have not been done, so to speak. And that is how we are trying to telescope our future moving forward. We believe it is something that can form a model. I think there is a future in terms of green growth, as we have seen. Beyond Kenya, I believe that the shift in energy will not only influence the balance, it will also influence the balance between countries, as well as configure new geographies of connections and interdependencies across regions. I was in Glasgow, and Prime Minister Modi's framework of one sun was quite fascinating. Talking about a grid that would connect everybody. I just imagined how huge that was, but I thought, how bold. I think we need to think in a very bold way. Within the East African region, we are talking about establishing a power pool, power auction. We are dealing with interconnectors so that we are able to sell power and create a stability across regions rather than within a country. That's a big dream, and I think it is the way to go in terms of just creating reliable, stable, resilient power for all. It also offers significant opportunities for shaping relations between regions. Of course, in terms of integration, but there is a flip side. If we don't manage it well, it can constitute a huge risk, as we know. So interconnection, yes, but how do we create frameworks for fusing together, for integrating, for sharing a common future and pursuing that common future together? More specifically for us in Kenya, we see an opportunity for leaping. And this comes with investment opportunities across the entire value chain, from standard setting and compliance frameworks to prospecting and de-risking levels, to generation and to ensuring distribution. And that includes the development of auxiliary services such as storage, questions around transmission and robust, resilient networks and systems, and questions of delivering the power to the end user. I think this calls for a partnership that addresses a lot of challenges, but they are possible because the possibilities are clear what we need to do. It is critical because this is the new frontier. And I believe, I really, really believe that the future of the world is going to be defined and shaped by how we manage, how we conceive and deploy the energy agenda today. With those few remarks, I will await questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador. You've really given us a lot to think about. I do not envy your portfolio. I mean, that would be a heavy portfolio for 5 of you. But I would like, if I may, to get you to drill down a little bit more in more detail in all of those issues that you talked about. All of them sound very significant. But what are your top priorities in terms of making the energy sector in Kenya perform the way you want it to do?
Well, the top priority, first of all, is to increase the efficiency of the utility, first of all, so that we can focus on delivery of energy. One of the big things that I came to in the Ministry of Energy was the percentage of commercial and system losses, which actually shocked me, you know. Ours is a one off-taker. We have one off-taker who takes all the power from everybody. And the fundamental question, business question you'd ask, why would a monopoly not perform? Yeah. So, but it is not a Kenyan problem, interestingly. That's why I was saying there's a big challenge across certainly the developing world with utilities. And so we are focused very, very sharply on loss reduction, growing the efficiency of the system. And that includes focusing on the business processes, ensuring management, those little things that deal with the bottom line, you know, of any company.
You mentioned that this problem of utility efficiency is not a Kenyan problem. I assume this is because of cross-border type connections. What are the challenges? What challenges do you face in developing these regional and inter-regional linkages to get people to focus on the common good rather than to look very inwardly?
Well, the first one, of course, is the availability of capital to drive it, because it is big. It is big project. For example, our interconnector with Ethiopia is upwards of 1,200 kilometer line, yeah, high voltage line. That's heavy. That's the heavy investment. So just bringing the investment components of it is a big one. Secondly, is if you run into political difficulties, okay? And this is not just for the power utility. It means you have at all times to nurture the relationships in order that you do not have extraneous factors that create a problem to that project. We have been having issues around relationship between the project and communities, okay? we are having a situation where communities don't have power and lines are going over them, you know, you have to deal with question of stepping the power down for purposes of benefiting them. So this question around just development becomes a big one. And how do you do compensation? How do they access the power as well? What other development activities do you introduce in the way-live areas as the power infrastructure is going through this area? So there are some mundane, very mundane things that can become a huge obstacle to the bigger agenda. So you're dealing from the localized, very localized delivery service end to all the way to the regional integration in terms of even the negotiations of tariffs. You know, what is the good tariff when you're dealing with this? And it has to do with all of you agreeing on the common standards. You know, it means you have to negotiate at the regional level. What are the common standards? What do you agree in terms of the weighing charges and all sorts of things? So there's a lot of things you have to mediate, both within energy technically, but politically, because it requires also a convergence of political goodwill beyond your country.
You mentioned a couple of times in your remarks about food security, and I followed the COP26 meetings in Glasgow, and we had at the Foreign Policy Research Institute after that a symposium on climate change and its impact on the African continent. One of the things that came out in that was that an issue that was not brought up at COP26 was the impact of climate change on food production.
True.
And I know it used to be a common bit of knowledge that 80% of sub-Saharan Africa is rural. And I think that's now down to about 60% and scheduled to be down as low as 40% rural by 2050. And that will impact food production, which is already being imperiled by climate change. But what the thing that I would like your views on is that the other aspect of food security is not just production of agricultural products, but the storage and transport of those products so they get into the tables of people in a form that they can use. So if you have climate change impacting agricultural production, a decrease in the number of people devoted to agriculture because they're moving to cities, and the fact that these two essential elements, transport and storage, are energy related. They require, how does the energy ministry factor these into its planning and operations?
Well, that is true. I think there is a direct correlation between a climate crisis and the state of food security. I don't think it's a Kenyan issue, but it takes a particular accent in the Horn of Africa, for example, which is very fragile. So it even adds up to the question of the crisis of movement of people. Now, the patterns, the climatic patterns for us have pushed this matter from being an emergency to almost the normal. So I don't think we should be saying, there's an emergency. It's not an emergency. We should actually be planning for this instability, because we are having cyclic droughts and famines, and they are more prevalent than the normal weather pattern. So what is emergency here? And I think that is, even in terms of planning, in Nairobi, we are grappling with this notion about the change character in the weather patterns, and what do you do about those, because they are directly impacting the entire possibility of food security. This is why part of our greatest investment is really in the water sector right now, so that we can move away from rain-fed agriculture, and you can have high productivity agriculture where you push for greater volumes in terms of production of specific items. So there's a lot of promotion in terms of research on the types of high yield seeds, the types of animal productivity that is growing the quantum and the quality rather than numbers and waiting for the rain-fed agriculture. The crisis in Ukraine is having a direct impact on the food stocks, because a lot of countries depended on Ukraine for wheat and oils and things like that. So it is a war out there, but we want it stopped because it has a direct impact on the food stocks that we are going to have on the continent. So it's a number of things that converge. Now, from an energy side, because of these cyclic droughts and floods, it has been affecting our historical baseload of power, which has been hydro. So the focus for us now is to increase the generation of the geothermal so that we can turn to geothermal becoming the baseload rather than hydro as we continue with adaptation measures along the water catchment area and the river where we get the hydropower. But this is a challenge for everybody. Now, not everybody has the luck of having geothermal, which is why the interconnection becomes very important, so that we can stabilize those countries that do not have the benefit of the geothermal power. So it all comes again together. That also means in terms of investment in power, we are looking very sharply at the frameworks that help us to negotiate the power purchase agreements. You know, actually one of the bigger items of my reform agenda is to look at the cost of power, because if you don't, then if we have less power, renewable power, we are going to have to depend on the thermals, which are very expensive. That will have a knock-on effect in terms of passing that cost to the consumer. So we have to just look at the entire value chain.
Another issue that that sort of concerns me, and that is, you mentioned hydropower. The climate change has impacted the amount of water available. I just as an example, when I went to Zimbabwe in 2009, my first visit to Victoria Falls, I was amazed when I was told that right after the rainy season, the volume of water coming over Victoria Falls was 1/3 less than it normally was for that time of year. And I tried, you know, if you think about the amount of hydroelectricity that represents, that reduction, that has ripple effects across the entire economy. But you also mentioned that not everyone is fortunate as Kenya in having access to geothermal energy. So can you be a little more specific in what Kenya is doing to try and provide or expand this bubble of stability in terms of power generation beyond its borders? Because, you know, what happens in a neighboring country could have an impact on Kenya and on its ability to prosper.
We have the focus on geothermal has included a whole range of building our own capability to do the drilling. So we are able now to do the drilling at home. And what we've done is within the various regional frameworks, we have offered that competency to the various countries. So we are helping with drilling in Ethiopia. We are doing drilling with Rwanda. We are doing exploration in Tanzania. So we are available, and there's actually, we've benefited quite a lot also with some of the institutions in this country in terms of just building that capability. So it is possible to transfer that so that we can begin, and Djibouti as well, because Djibouti has a good potential. If you look at the belt, the Rift Valley belt countries, it seems to have a good quantum of the possibility for geothermal. And so our generating company has been availed to the various countries that are willing to partner, and we're doing that with them.
You talked about your transfer to clean energy. Could you give us a little more specifics on the scheduling and some of the key points in Kenya's transition to clean energy?
Well, right now we are working on a number of sources. We have the largest wind plant on the continent, the Lake Turkana. It is performing very well. Actually, its performance is rated probably the highest globally at almost 60%. We have solar. We finished the first, and it's doing very well, of 50 megawatts in Garissa. And what we are doing in the far-flung areas is really to go off-grid by use of solar, particularly small mini grids, so that they can, and they're playing a very good role in terms of stabilizing the grid, particularly in far-off areas. So solar is probably the one that we're going to do very quick multiplier with. We're also moving into biogas, particularly for clean cooking, and it's doing quite well, especially in the peri-urban areas. A number of companies, small ones, Kenyan ones, which means it is contributing to localized innovations that are helping a lot, particularly in terms of clean cooking. I have said solar, wind, biomass, what else? Hydro, of course we do hydro, we do geothermal. So the mix is good. And I think we are lucky that way, that we are able to cut through all this. But we still have thermal plants. We hope that we can phase them out. We are looking at gas at an intermediary in terms of looking at the thermal plants. We are in conversation with Tanzania for a gas pipeline out of Tanzania into Kenya. So discussions are quite advanced in this regard. So unlike many other countries, we are lucky because our portfolio is large. And I think, well, with this large portfolio, of course, there are questions around the mix. How do we mix them in the grid? These are some of the issues that we are grappling with. We have issues around storage, because this technology is still developing, in terms of storage. So we are still losing quite a substantial amount of power because of the lack of the capability to store. For example, we have to vent our geothermal at some point, which is not a good thing. There is conversation around using this extra power to create green hydrogen. So we are having some conversations around this, and they are looking quite promising. We've begun to launch the e-vehicles, including public transport, so that we can consume this power that we are having. So still, as I said, breaking the barriers as we move into this new path.
Kenya has been one of the more active countries on the continent in the U.S. government's Power Africa program. But I'd just like to ask you this. It's a bit of a provocative question, but looking at programs that are Africa focused, like Power Africa, if you could change or improve one thing about U.S. policy towards Africa, what would that be?
Ooh, provocative. What that would be, frankly, is to urge the US government to offer comfort to their private sector. I think the US private sector does not fully understand the array of opportunities that the African continent has, and there is not sufficient comfort. And that is where the big argument about looking east and things like that. I think if there was one thing I would urge is for the government to provide comfort so that we can see a scale up of American investment on the continent, because the opportunities are huge, they are diverse, and they have good returns.
Thank you. I notice that there seem to be some questions from our streaming audience. So I'm sorry, we have a question from the live audience. So who has a question?
I have a
Please.
here.
My name is Khalidou Gadio. I work for a law firm named Curtis just across the street. I worked for a number of years at the African Development Bank, and I can attest indeed about the Lake Turkana Bridge. We definitely were one of the biggest financiers. So indeed, that is true. Kenya has taken lead on wind, and that was a fairly important a project in which I personally have participated in. Now, I have two questions. One, I would like to have your views on the issue, because most of the time in Africa, indeed, it is expensive to produce, energy. Transmission is a problem, but the biggest problem seems to be distribution. And I just wanted to know whether you have views on why is it so and what are possible solutions. Because sometimes you have even excess capacity and it's not easily transmitted, but most of the time transmission is fairly okay, but distribution definitely is a major problem. The second question I have is that, which is maybe a little bit provocative, but given again your background both as in diplomacy, defense, and now energy, I just want to know whether you have a comment on the issue you have with Somalia, because obviously you're fighting over a certain part of the territory. And then I think behind that sort of conflict, everybody knows it's energy. Because as you know, there's a recent decision taken by some authorities in Somalia about drilling or even, giving contract to the American companies actually for concessions. I just wanted to have your views on those issues. Thank you.
Shall I take that?
Oh, yes, ma'am, please.
No, thank you very much. And for those two questions, the first one is one of direct concern to me now. And your observations are right in terms of the challenges of the last mile, provision of power to the end users. What we did in Kenya, we've been in a process that has taken a bit of time in terms of unbundling the various roles. And so we are having agencies that are focusing on one, prospecting and de-risking. We are having agencies that are focusing on generation. We are having agencies that are focusing on transmission and on the distribution. Now, the structure of the distribution from the Kenyan perspective, in fact, that last end that you're talking about constitutes more than 2/3 of the consumers, but it is the small scale consumers. Lots of them, it's really social service, first tier of consumers. And that's where, the village, the communities, even the schools and things like that. And so I think part of the solution must be clarifying that role and the obligation of the people, because at the tail end, you have a large consumer tier that you're going to have to subsidize. Our last mile, people pay for connection, we pay 15,000. What is 15,000, David? 15,000 is $150 for connection, and you can pay it over a period of time. The idea is to have universal coverage because in our calculation, that has better impact in terms of multiplication of production. Once you do that, then you enable a household to do something else, probably to manufacture their little yogurts and sell it, to store their milk when they milk the cows in the morning. There's a whole lot of multiplier effect. So you're not counting at the point of paying the tariff for the power, but it is facilitating the growth and productivity at different ends. So, but it means that government has to subsidize, because 150 for connection and for it is very difficult. But it also means in terms of just service management, is the power going in? Are you cleaning the trusses? Are you connecting? That entire cost has to be underwritten by the exchequer. So, but it is a big issue. But I think at the tail end, our perception is that it's a social service rather than a commercially viable investment. And then you focus on the larger productive sector, you know, which is a small number, but the ones that are consuming power for purposes of industry, for purposes of job generation, for purposes of driving the economy and so forth. So but I think it's a matter of creating a structure that helps you to have a full view, again, of the distribution chain at that tail end of production. Not an easy one. I remember 3 weeks ago, we were sat with colleagues from the East African community, and we were actually talking precisely about this point in terms of how do we define it and how do we justify it, so that even when we meet with our partners, those that are helping us in terms of the resources, you can define the objective of this part, which is 2/3 of your consumer tire, really. The second one on Somalia, this is a big one. It's a big one, and it is true. We have had a tiff with Somalia. We believe that this is something that we could solve. Somalia approached the ICJ, as you probably know. We did not agree with that process from beginning to end, but we still believe, this is my personal view, I'm out of MFA, we still believe that there is room for us to engage, because the accident of geography, there's nothing you can do about the accident of geography of being neighbors. But I think we have a duty to, within the integration agenda and within the realization that our destiny is inextricably linked, we have a duty to make sure that this does not turn into a difficult situation. And we believe there is a way forward.
Any other questions from the live audience? Over here.
Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Stephen McGann. I'm a retired Foreign Service officer, and I happen to have served in Nairobi in the mid-90s. So I'm quite familiar with Kenya, but this question isn't really a Kenya-specific question. But it does, you touched upon in your discussion, urbanization. And this brings to mind, where do we stand, not just in Kenya, but in Africa as a whole, as we look at rethinking the transport sector? There's an over-reliance, as we well know, on the internal combustion engine, fossil fuel cars. African cities weren't designed to have light rail to move people around. And now that we're moving toward electric vehicles, we now have to think of a new infrastructure for transport. So I was wondering, what are your thoughts on how do we move forward? What are those items that we can embrace? And still, what do we have to retrofit in order to accommodate transport needs and energy needs in rapidly growing African urban settings? Thank you.
I think that's a really important question, particularly in the light of the speed of urbanization on the continent. You know, if you look at the movement from rural to urban areas and the proliferation of peri-urban settlement, it's happening very quickly. And this is a big debate issue within Habitat in Nairobi. You know, the question around designing our cities, but more importantly, as you say, designing the transport corridors. A matter that has not moved as quickly as the population mobility. You know, I think there is a mismatch there in terms of the designs and the reality on the ground. But I know that in Kenya, we have been focused on this. And even in terms of the intercity transport, there's a lot of thinking about the possibility of future conversion, so that even when we are having diesel locomotives, there's always a sense of what in the planning, when in the future we are ready, can we translate this into electric trains and things like that? We are within the metropolitan city of Nairobi now, there is a complete reorganization of that transport system. And we are having light rails, and I'm sure you've seen that also in Addis Ababa. You've seen it in South Africa. There's a lot of that type of thinking. But I think there's a lot of pressure because it's not matching the growth of the urban, the cities. Particularly, in the next couple of weeks, I think we're going to have the first Afro-Cities Summit in Kisumu, actually. And this is one of the big debate issues that is going to be canvassed there. So, but the other way of seeing it, this is the opportunity in terms of investment. And I know there is some discussions around twinning with some of the cities in other parts of the world, so that you can bring these lessons also in terms of fast tracking that planning and execution. So it is a big issue, and I think one that is of concern, particularly with colleagues within the transport and infrastructure ministries.
My name is Andrew Suf-Maxwell. I'm with Fieldstone, a financial advisor. We do a lot of work across the continent. And just picking up on one of your remarks about the cost base and performance of the sector. And I think your remarks were maybe focused on the domestic consumer and the impact on lives generally of getting the costs down. But when you look at Kenya's green resources, which are kind of world scale competitive, and you think about manufacturing industry that may be looking to resource and to move and to reposition around the world. Do you see a way in which you can, if you like, separate those two to make Kenya an attractive destination for industry looking to resource, so you can then capture the benefit of what the natural resources you've got without kind of getting stuck with the legacy costs of the, if you like, the existing utility areas, which are less efficient than maybe they should be?
There's no doubt that this is a new growth area. That's the way we are conceiving it. As the debate, global debate on cutting carbon emissions and continues and gains traction, I think industry is going to continue being inclined to manufacture with limited carbon footprint. I think that's the way it is going to go. And increasingly, we are beginning to get inquiries about the possibility of moving industries, and I think this is a possibility, so that they can use green energy for production. So it becomes a brand thing, but it also contributes to the bigger global agenda. So I see there is an opportunity here. I think the critical thing for me is creating the right framework at this point, so that we might not get it completely right, but I think we need to create the standards and the regulations and the framework that enable this to happen, and how it grows, I don't know, but my sense is that this is the way industry is going to go. So here is another window, and I think it just depends on how well we push it. It could jolly well become a door very quickly.
We have
a question from our audience, from the home audience. Earlier this week, we had a really interesting program on women's health and education in Africa. And one of the points that was made was that educated young Africans, there aren't employment opportunities for them. And I'd like to ask about, is there any kind of an effort or a plan, or what would you recommend to find opportunities for these young educated Africans in alternative energy and as part of the plan to transition?
That's a very good question, and really, because only last week I was having a conversation with women in the extractives, you know. And when you look at the structure of it, whether it is in terms of the number of women engineers, geologists, physicists that we are generating, that number is still small. And so a lot of women that are dealing with the subterranean wealth across the continent are at the end. In mining, they are the artisanal miners. In the renewables, it's still a big boys club. And I think this is the big issue. We need to have the presence of mind so that in this transition, women don't come at the tail end of the transition. So I think it has to be quite specific. And in my mind, this is where we are going. I'm very pleased that our generation company, which is performing very well, is headed by a CEO that is a woman that is performing extremely well. In the transformation that we're undertaking now of the Kenya Power and Lighting Company, the chair of the board is a woman, and she's doing a great job to the chagrin of many people who don't want to pay their tariffs. You know, but she is as hard as granite, and she is pushing through it. So, but I think we need to have a presence of mind so that this does not become another frontier of exclusion for women. The possibilities here are great, but the big question is, how do we leapfrog women to be in the front line, to be fast movers rather than those that come from behind? And so the structures I was talking about in terms of frameworks for financing, frameworks for technology transfer, frameworks for capacity building need to be sensitive to this reality if we are serious. And I think it's important because as we move towards universal provision, universal provision of power and electricity, aware that even when you talk about clean cooking, the large percentage of population that you are dealing with actors are women. I think we need to be very specific in terms of the framework that we develop to promote this as a matter of justice and equity.
Thank you. I think we are just about out of time. And Madam Secretary, before we close, are there any final remarks you would like to make?
Well, as I said, I am very delighted to be here, but I believe strongly. We have seen in the history of man that we always come to epochs where a certain development shapes the way the world evolves and the way development is pursued. A couple of years back, that was the digital revolution. I think we are at a cusp of a moment where energy is going to shape the world of the future. And so as we pursue a just system, it must be a question about the type of energy and how we make sure that the whole of humanity is fully engaged in a just and equal manner.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Secretary. Thank you, Ambassador Ray, for a fascinating and a really important conversation today. And I'd like to say a special thanks to our Africa Program Advisory Council member, Pete Morocco, who made this event this morning possible. Thanks, Pete. I hope you're listening online. It was a wonderful program, and thanks for your support. I'd also like to say on our back table, we have some copies of Orbis, which is FPRI's quarterly journal, and our summer edition focused on Africa. So we have some copies of that, as well as the fall and winter edition. The winter edition focuses on Russia. So that's also of great interest right now. Anyway, thank you again for coming. Thank you, Secretary, Madam Secretary and Ambassador Ray, and to the Kenyan Embassy for helping to make this all possible this morning. Take care and all the best.
Thank you. Thank you, Ray.